By September 1944, the intoxicating scent of victory had become a dangerous narcotic for the Allied High Command. The lightning-fast breakout from Normandy and the subsequent collapse of the German 7th Army had convinced many that the Wehrmacht was a spent force, a hollowed-out shell waiting for a final shove. General Bernard Montgomery, usually the most cautious and methodical of commanders, suddenly found himself gripped by an uncharacteristic and feverish urgency. He envisioned a daring, singular thrust that would bypass the formidable Siegfried Line and strike directly at the industrial heart of the Reich, ending the war by Christmas. This was the genesis of Operation Market Garden, a plan so ambitious it bordered on the reckless, a gamble that relied on a perfect alignment of logistics, weather, and enemy incompetence. But in the unforgiving theater of war, perfection is a ghost that often leads men to their graves. The architecture of the operation was divided into two distinct but codependent parts. Market was the airborne component, the largest the world had ever seen, involving 3.5 divisions dropped behind enemy lines to seize a series of vital bridges in the Netherlands. Garden was the ground force, the heavy armor of the British XXX Corps, tasked with racing up a single, narrow two-lane highway to link these airborne pockets into a continuous corridor. The ultimate prize was the Great Road Bridge at Arnhem, the final gateway across the Lower Rhine and into Germany itself. It was a plan that demanded the precision of a Swiss watch, yet it was being executed in a landscape of shifting shadows and unpredictable resistance. The Allies were essentially betting the lives of 30,000 paratroopers on the hope that the German Lion was not just sleeping, but dead. Systemic failure began not on the battlefield, but in the mahogany-paneled offices where ego outweighed evidence. Major Brian Urquhart, the young and brilliant intelligence officer for the 1st Allied Airborne Army, looked at the latest aerial reconnaissance photos with a growing sense of dread. He saw the distinct, unmistakable silhouettes of German armor nestled in the woods just north of Arnhem, identifying them as elements of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions. When he brought these concerns to his superiors, he was met not with professional inquiry, but with a forced medical leave for supposedly being overworked. The command structure had become calcified by its own success, unwilling to let inconvenient truths derail the momentum of its grand design. This refusal to acknowledge the presence of elite German units would prove to be the Operation and APO's original sin. As the massive air armada took flight on the morning of September 17, the technical flaws of the mission began to manifest with cruel timing. The British 1st Airborne Division, the Red Devils, were assigned the most distant and difficult objective at Arnhem, yet their drop zones were placed nearly 8 miles from the bridge they were meant to capture. This decision, born of a fear of German anti-aircraft fire and soft soil, traded the element of surprise for a long, grueling march through enemy territory. Furthermore, the radio sets issued to the paratroopers were fundamentally ill-suited for the densely wooded and urban terrain of the Netherlands. The Type 22 sets, designed for short-range communication, were plagued by faulty crystals and interference from the iron-rich soil. From the moment they hit the ground, the British units would be effectively deaf and blind to one another, a recipe for tactical disintegration. The German response was as swift as it was unexpected, spearheaded by Field Marshal Walter Model, a man known as Hitler and APO's fireman for his ability to stabilize collapsing fronts. By a stroke of dark luck for the Allies, Model was actually lunching at a hotel in Oosterbeek when the first paratroopers began to descend. Initially believing it was a specialized commando raid sent to kidnap him, Model quickly grasped the strategic scale of the invasion and began organizing a defense with ruthless efficiency. He mobilized the 2 SS Panzer Corps under Wilhelm Bittrich, units that were supposed to be refitting but were still capable of lethal violence. The Germans were not the disorganized rabble the Allied planners had imagined, they were a wounded predator, and the paratroopers had just landed in its jaws. On the ground, the reality of the two-lane highway began to choke the life out of the garden half of the operation. XXX Corps found itself trapped on a thin strip of tarmac surrounded by marshy ground that made off-road maneuvering impossible for their Sherman tanks. Every German anti-tank gun hidden in the woods could stall the entire column for hours, creating a traffic jam of epic and tragic proportions. The highway, which the paratroopers would soon dub Hell and APO's Highway, became a graveyard of burning vehicles and shattered schedules. The ground troops were fighting for every yard, while the clock was ticking for the men waiting at the bridges further north. The synergy required for the plan to work was dissolving into a series of isolated, desperate skirmishes. At Arnhem, the situation took on the quality of a Greek tragedy. Only a single battalion, led by the indomitable Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, managed to reach the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge. They occupied the surrounding houses and prepared for a siege, unaware that the rest of the division was being systematically cut off and pinned down in the suburbs of Oosterbeek. Frost and Appos' men were a tiny island of resistance in a rising sea of German steel, holding the gateway to the Rye against overwhelming odds. They were equipped with light weapons and limited ammunition, facing off against the heavy machine guns and armored cars of the SS. For 3 days and nights, the bridge was a scene of horrific, close-quarters combat, illuminated by the orange glow of burning buildings. Amidst the chaos, the story of the Dutch resistance remains one of the most poignant and overlooked chapters of the disaster. Local civilians risked everything to provide intelligence, food, and medical aid to the paratroopers, often paying the ultimate price when the Germans retook territory. They watched in horror as the liberation they had prayed for turned into a bloody stalemate in their own streets and gardens. The Dutch people were not just spectators, they were active participants who saw their homes reduced to rubble in a battle they had no power to stop. Their bravery was a silent counterpoint to the logistical failures of the Allied High Command, a testament to the human spirit in the face of systemic collapse. The tragedy of the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade, led by Major General Stanislaw Sosabowski, adds a layer of bitter irony to the narrative. Sosabowski had been a vocal critic of the plan from the beginning, accurately predicting the tactical pitfalls that would eventually doom the mission. When his men were finally dropped into the fray, late and in the wrong location due to poor weather, they were used as scapegoats for the failures of British leadership. The Polish paratroopers fought with a ferocity born of a desire to liberate their own homeland, yet they were thrown into a meat grinder that had already been lost. Their sacrifice was immense, yet they were treated with a cold indifference by the very men who had ignored their warnings. By the time the decision was made to evacuate the remnants of the 1st Airborne Division, Arnhem had become a charnel house. Operation Berlin, the nocturnal withdrawal across the Rhine, was a desperate scramble for survival under the cover of rain and darkness. Of the 10,000 men who had landed at Arnhem, fewer than 2,000 made it back to Allied lines. The rest were killed, wounded, or captured, a generation of elite soldiers sacrificed for a plan that was too rigid to survive contact with reality. The Red Devils had earned their reputation for legendary courage, but they had been betrayed by a failure of imagination at the highest levels of command. The bridge at Arnhem remained in German hands, a silent monument to the limits of military hubris. The historical philosophical takeaway of Market Garden is a sobering meditation on the dangers of confirmation bias and the fragility of complex systems. It serves as a reminder that in war, the most brilliant plan is nothing more than a fantasy if it ignores the agency and resilience of the enemy. The Allies fell into the trap of believing their own propaganda, assuming that because they were winning, the enemy had already lost. They treated the battlefield as a chessboard where the pieces would move exactly as predicted, forgetting that the board itself was made of mud, blood, and the unpredictable wills of thousands of desperate men. The bridge too far was not just a geographical objective, it was a psychological boundary that Montgomery and his staff crossed at their own peril. As the dust settled over the ruined streets of Arnhem and the flooded fields of the Netherlands, the war continued for another 8 agonizing months. The shortcut to Berlin had turned into a long, bloody detour that claimed countless more lives on both sides. The soldiers who fought there, from the paratroopers in the attics to the tank crews on the highway, performed with a gallantry that deserved a better plan. They were the victims of a structural failure that prioritized speed over security and optimism over intelligence. Their story remains a haunting echo of what happens when the machinery of war outpaces the wisdom of those who operate it. We look back at the maps and the grainy footage today, seeing the ghosts of young men moving through the smoke of a Dutch autumn. We see the faces of those who held the bridge and those who died trying to reach it, their bravery frozen in time against the backdrop of a catastrophic era. Operation Market Garden stands as a testament to the enduring truth that no amount of courage can fully compensate for a lack of clarity. It is a narrative of what could have been, a shadow play of ambition and agony that still resonates in the silent forests of Oosterbeek. The bridges have been rebuilt, and the fields are green once more, but the lessons of September 1944 remain etched in the soil, a solemn warning to all who would seek to end a war with a single, desperate stroke. The legacy of Arnhem is not found in the tactical gains, for there were none, but in the enduring spirit of the men who stood their ground when all hope was lost. They fought for each other, for their units, and for a cause that felt righteous even as the sky turned black with German shells. Their sacrifice was a profound expression of human resilience in the face of systemic collapse, a light that shone briefly and brightly in the darkest hours of the European conflict. As the sun sets over the lower Rhine, the shadows of the gliders seem to linger on the horizon, reminding us that the cost of victory is often paid in the currency of the brave. The war would eventually end, but for the families of the fallen, the bridge at Arnhem would always be just one step beyond reach, a tragic symbol of a promise unfulfilled. In the final accounting of history, Market Garden remains a masterpiece of missed opportunities, a cinematic tragedy where the heroes did everything right, and the system did everything wrong. The echoes of the guns have long since faded, replaced by the quiet rustle of the wind through the Dutch poplars and the soft murmur of the river. Yet, the story of Arnhem continues to serve as a mirror, reflecting the eternal struggle between the grand designs of leaders and the harsh realities of the soldier and Appo's life. It is a story of mud and fire, of silence and screams, and of a bridge that became a graveyard for an army's dreams. As we close this chapter of the Great Crusade, we are left with the image of a lone bugler sounding the last post over the hallowed ground of the Austerbeek Cemetery. It is a sound that carries the weight of 10,000 stories, a final, haunting tribute to the men who went to a bridge too far and never came back.